Welcome back to another AP Computer Science A free response question problem. In this problem, we're going to be talking about question 4. So this one says, this question involves reasoning about a number puzzle that is represented as a two-dimensional array of integers. Each element of the array initially contains a value between 1 and 9 inclusive. Solving the puzzle involves clearing pairs of array elements by setting them to 0. Two elements can be cleared if their values sum to 10 or if they have the same value. The puzzle is considered solved if all elements of the array are cleared. You will write the constructor and one method of the SumOrSameGame class, which contains the method that manipulate elements of the puzzle. So for problem A, it says to write the constructor for the SumOrSameGame class. The constructor initializes the instance variable puzzle to be a two-dimensional array, integer array with a number of rows and columns specified by the parameters numRows and numCols respectively. Array elements are initialized with random integers between 1 and 9 inclusive, each with an equal chance of being assigned to each element of puzzle. When an element of the two-dimensional array is accessed, the first index is used to specify the row, and the second index is used to specify the column. All right, so we have this constructor that we want to write the code for. So let's go ahead and jump into the pseudocode for it. So remember that we have this two-dimensional puzzle instance variable here. It has only been declared. It hasn't been initialized yet. So we're going to want to initialize the puzzle 2D array so that we can then put numbers inside of it. So what we're going to do is we're going to loop through the rows. Remember that a two-dimensional array is row major, so that first number that we put within the square brackets when we are trying to grab the value in a two-dimensional array is going to be the row, and then the second value is going to be the column. So if, for example, we wanted to do a nested loop, we're going to want to also loop through the columns of each row. So we take the two-dimensional array row by row, and then we look at each column within that row to get through every single index of the two-dimensional array. So then what are we doing for each index within the two-dimensional array? Well, we want to be setting that value equal to some random number between 1 and 9 inclusive. So first we're going to have to generate a random number 1 to 9 inclusive on both ends. And then what do we want to do? Well, we want to set the value at that row and that column to the random number. And that should pretty much be it for our nested loop code. As soon as we're done looking through every single row and every single column and setting the value there to some random number between 1 and 9, we are done with our constructor. So let's go ahead and start jumping into the implementation, the actual code. So initializing the puzzle 2D array, remember we've already declared it, so we can just go ahead and say puzzle equals, how do we initialize a new 2D array? We say new int, and then we have our two pairs of square brackets, and the first number we're going to provide is the number of rows in the two-dimensional array, and that's the value that's being passed into the constructor, numRows. The second value will be the number of columns, and that's that second parameter that's being passed in. And then that is it for the initialization. So looping through the rows, this is going to be a for loop. So for int, we could use I and j here for our outer and inner loop. I'm going to go ahead and use r just because I think it's a little bit easier to connect that to row. So r is equal to 0, right? We start at the first row in the array, and then we make sure that that is going to be less than numRows, r plus plus. With number of rows, so that's the number of rows that we have in this two-dimensional array. What we could also do is we could do puzzle.length if we wanted to. I prefer number of rows just because it makes a little bit more sense to me, but yeah, you can do puzzle.length here. Inside of the row for loop, what we're going to do is we're going to loop through the columns. So we're going to have another for loop. This one, it's going to have our looping variable set to c. So let's make sure that c is less than the number of columns, c++. And for the upper bound of the for loop, we could also have this be puzzle of 0.length if we wanted to. I prefer number of columns, or it could be puzzle of r. We're going to have the same number of columns for every single row in the two-dimensional array, so it doesn't really matter. But I'm just going to do number of columns just to make it a little bit easier on myself. Okay, so then generating a random number 1 through 9 inclusive. So anytime you see generate a random number, I want you to immediately think of math.random, okay? Math.random is going to be your friend here. So what does math.random return us? So if we don't do anything to the value that is returned, what this returns is a double. Let's say random number. What are the ranges of the possible number that it would give us? It's going to be between 0.0 inclusive and 1.0 exclusive. So it might include 0.0, but it's not going to include 1.0. It's going to be some number in between those two. Okay, so you might notice that there's a bit of a difference between 0.0 to 1 exclusive and 1 through 9 inclusive. Take a second and pause the video. Think about a few things that are different here. So the things that I'm seeing different are that the lower bound is different, right? Here we get 0.0 and here we have 1. The upper bound is also different. We have 1.0 and we have 9 as our upper bound. And then also, math.random returns a double, but what we want is an int. Remember, this puzzle is made up of a bunch of ints. So we're going to have to manipulate the value that we get back from math.random a little bit so that we get not only the right numbers, but also the right type of number. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to be an int. So we are going to be casting it to an int at some point. Anytime you cast something to an int, what's going to happen is you're just getting rid of the decimal points, right? We don't have that additional information for an int. With a double, we have the decimal point. With ints, we don't. So now that we've cast it, what we have is 0 to 1 inclusive on the lower bound, exclusive on the upper bound. So we're still going to have to do a little bit of manipulation to math.random to get our 1 through 9 inclusive value. So we see that the upper bound for what we have currently is 1. What we want it to be 9. So what we can do is we can take the value of math.random and we can multiply it by 9. So then what we're going to get is we're going to get 0, the lower bound, 0 times 9 is still going to be 0. But for our upper bound, we're going to get 9 exclusive. Okay, so we're one step closer to what we want the number to be, but we're just off by 1 a little bit. And so since we're off by 1, what we can do is we can just add 1 to the value that we're going to get from the rest of this. Okay, so now what we have is 1 inclusive through 10 exclusive. So since it's 10 exclusive, that's the same thing as 9 inclusive. So now we have actually generated a random number 1 through 9 inclusive. What we just needed to do was multiply by 9 and add 1 and also cast it to an int. So we've generated our random number and it is between 1 and 9 inclusive. So now we didn't just generate it for no random reason, right? We actually want to set the value at that row and that column to the random number. So remember that we are setting the values of puzzle, and remember that the first value in the square brackets is going to be the row. We're using r as our looping variable for the row, so we're going to set that equal to r, and then we're going to set the other one equal to c, and that is going to be set equal to random number. And that is pretty much it for the code for the constructor. So they don't really provide an example for the constructor, so you kind of just have to assume that your math.random logic will work. So yeah, here's what the constructor looks like without any of the pseudocode. You're initializing the 2D array with the number of rows and the number of columns. Then you're looping through the number of rows and the number of columns. You're creating a random number at each of the indices, and then you're setting the row and the column to that number. That's pretty much it. We're going to be talking about problem 4b. So this one says, write the clear pair method, which takes a valid row index and valid column index as its parameters. The array element specified by those indices, which has a value between 1 and 9 inclusive, is compared to other array elements in puzzle and attempt to pair it with another array element that meets both of the following conditions. The row index of the second element is greater than or equal to the parameter row, and the two elements have equal values or have values that sum to 10. If such an array element is found, both array elements of the pair are cleared, set to 0, and the method returns true. If more than one such array element is found, any one of those identified array elements can be used to complete the pair and can be cleared. If no such array element is found, no changes are made to puzzle and the method returns false. And then there's a bunch of possible results of several calls to clear pair. So the first time I kind of read this, I was a little bit confused. So let's go ahead and take a look at the first example and let's understand what we're actually trying to do here. So you'll see that the method call clear pair 0, 1. So the first number is a row, and the second number is a column. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the value at the 0th row, so the first row in the two-dimensional array, and the second column, because rows and columns are 0 indexed. So it looks like the value there is going to be 7. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to look at all of the rows that are greater than or equal to the parameter row. So if there was another row above us, we wouldn't be looking at that row. It's only going to be in the row that is being passed in or below. That's pretty important to remember. And then we're looking to see if there's another value that's either in the same row or lower and has the same value. Or if you take the value that we were looking at and add another value and that adds up to 10, then we have found a match. So it's one of the two would be considered a pair. So let's go ahead and write some pseudocode first so that we sort of understand what we want to be doing here. So we are given a row and a column, and everything sort of hinges around the value that's found at that given row and column. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab the value at the given row and column. And why do we care so much about this value? Well, this is the value we're going to be comparing to see if there's any other value that's in that row or lower that equals that value, or if you add that value and some other value, it equals 10. So we need this value so that when we're looping later on, we understand what we're looking for. So I think also we should figure out what 10 minus that value is, so that basically what we're doing is we're saving the two values we're looking for so that later on when we're looping, we understand what we're looking for, okay? So then what we're going to do is we're going to loop through the rows. Remember that two-dimensional arrays are row major, so the outer for loop is going to loop over the rows. The inner for loop is going to loop through the columns. And so then what are we doing inside of the two for loops? So if we're not looking at the value at the given row and column, because remember that when we're looping through the rows and the columns, the index that was passed in is also inside the two-dimensional array. So we want to make sure that we're not looking at the same value that we just grabbed, because otherwise we'll see that it is a match, but we won't see that there's any other match within the array, for example. So we want to make sure that we're not just saying there's a match because we're matching it with itself. We want to find some other number that will match or add up to 10 with it. So if we're not looking at the value at the given row and column, then what? Then what's another condition we want to look for? We want to make sure it's a match. So if we find a match, and what are we defining as a match? So that's another element in the array has the same value as the one we're looking for, or if another element plus the given element add up to 10. So these are the two conditions that make it a match. If this is true, what do we want to do? Well, we are clearing out the pair, and we're defining as clearing out the pair as setting the value at those two different indices to 0. So set the value at the current row and column to 0. And then we also want to set the value at that given row and column to 0 as well. Set the value at the given row and column to 0. And finally, remember that this returns a Boolean based on if we were able to find a pair, and we are going to return true if we found an element that matches the criteria. Maybe I'll replace this with if we find a pair. Okay. And that's pretty much it for the logic inside of the nested loops. If we've made it through the entire two-dimensional array and we haven't returned true yet, what that means is that we failed to find a pair. So we're gonna go ahead and return false if we couldn't find an element that matches the criteria. And that's pretty much it for the pseudocode. So let's go ahead and start writing the actual code. So getting the value at the given row and column, let's go ahead and set this equal to maybe first value to find. So the way that we are going to grab it, row major, we're going to grab the row first and then the column. We're going to put that inside of an int. And then we're going to go ahead and figure out what 10 minus that value is. So second value to find is going to be 10 minus first value to find. Okay, so if we find either one of these two values inside of the two-dimensional array in a row that's later than the one that we were given, we know that we have found a pair. So let's go ahead and loop through the rows. So once again, I'm going to use R as our looping variable for the outer loop. So you might be tempted to start at 0, but why is 0 the wrong starting index here? 0 is the wrong starting index because one of the conditions we were given is that the row index of the second element is greater than or equal to the parameter row. So we are only looking at rows that are either the row that we were given or further down in the two-dimensional array. So row is actually going to be our starting index for our for loop. Okay, and then we can make sure that it's less than, so we're going to have to grab the number of rows in this two-dimensional array, which is puzzle.length, and then r++. All right, now we're going to loop through the columns. So int c. So for this one, there's nothing in the problem that says which column it has to be in, just which row it has to be in. So we can actually set our column equal to 0 to start off with, and make sure that that is less than the number of columns in the two-dimensional array, which we can grab using the length of the first array in the two-dimensional array, the first row in the two-dimensional array, C++. And now we need to make sure that we are not looking at the value at the given row and column. Otherwise, we're going to try to pair it up with itself. So what we're going to do here is we're going to make sure that our looping variable for r is not equal to row, which is the parameter that was passed in, or the looping variable c, the column we're currently looking at, is not equal to col, which is the parameter that was being passed in. And so you might be thinking to yourself, why is this an or and not an and? The reason is because it's okay if we're looking in the same row as long as the column is different. And it's okay if we're looking at the same column as long as the row is different, right? So if r is equal to row and c is equal to column, what this means is we're just looking at the given row and column, and that's not going to be a pair. So as long as one of these is not true, we are able to continue with our search. If we find a pair, so the two conditions we're looking for, the two values we're looking for are up here. So if puzzle at, we're gonna row major, so r is the first value we're indexing, c is the second one we're indexing. If this is equal to first value to find, so if it's the same exact value as the given row and column, then that's a pair. It's also a pair if the value at that row and column is equal to second value to find, which is that the first value to find plus whatever number we're looking at now add up to 10. So if either one of those is true, then we have a pair. If we have a pair, what we're doing is we're going to clear out that pair. So set the value at the current row and column to 0. So the current row and column is puzzle of rc, and we're going to set that equal to 0. We also want to set the value at the given row and column to 0. So that's puzzle at row col, where those are the values that were passed in as parameters. We're setting that equal to 0. And then we're going to return true if we found an element that matches that criteria, which would be true in this case. And that is all the code for our loop. So if we've made it to the end of our loop, we've made it through every single element in the array that's either in the row that we were given or further down in the array, and we didn't return true, what we're going to do is we're going to return false because we actually weren't able to find a pair. And that's pretty much it for all of the code for the clear pair method. So here is what our final clear pair method looks like without any pseudocode. We grab the value at the given row, given column, and store it in a variable to make sure that if we see that later in that same row or later on, then we found a pair. Or we also subtract it from 10 to see if we can find that second value in that row or later. We have our two for loops. And for our outer for loop, we start at the row. So we're not looking at any rows before the one that was given. and we start our inner loop at 0 so that we can look at all of the columns within those rows. We make sure we're not actually looking at the given row, given column, because we can't pair it with itself. We check whether it's equal to one of the two values that it should equal to. If it does, then we zero out both of those indices and we return true. Otherwise, we return false. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below and I'll get back to you. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.